everyone. Welcome back to LumCon Science Talks. I know it's been a while. I hope you all had a really great Thanksgiving and are looking forward to a great and safe holiday season. Anyway, Craig cannot join us tonight, so you know you're in trouble. But I just want to remind our audience out there before we get started tonight that you can communicate with me and Dr. La Peyre by using the question box. So you should somewhere on your screen have a GoToWebinar dashboard. One of the options that you have in that dashboard is a question box. So just to make sure everyone has a handle on how to use that tool, I'm going to ask you a question. So no jokes tonight, but a question. What we would like to know tonight is, one, if you are wearing an ugly sweater, because 'tis the season, and two, if you eat oysters, and if so, how? How do you like to deliver them to your face? Oh, Chandler, you don't like oysters? It's all right. It's all right. Strong feelings about oysters coming in, Megan. Yes. Steve. All right. John likes them fried. Mary prefers them steamed. Very good. Jacqueline likes them raw. Nice. We were getting a lot of them. Good job, you guys. No ugly sweaters, though. Oh, well. I guess 'tis not the season yet for ugly sweaters. All right, you guys. It seems like we all have the question box figured out. So we'll get started. It is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Megan La Peyre, and I'm sorry, I'm going to look away so I can read the introduction. Megan is a research biologist with the U.S. Geological Survey, Louisiana Fish and Wildlife Cooperative Research Unit, and adjunct professor with the School of Renewable and Natural Resources at LSU Ag Center. Oh, I'm sorry, and LSU Ag Center. Is that right? Or they're separate, right?
It's part of the Ag Center.
Okay, it is part of the Ag Center. Very good. And I should know that. Not at 7 o'clock on a Thursday, though. In her roles, she works with graduate and undergraduate students, teaches natural resource policies and communication seminars, leads research projects, and serves as the Gulf DOI representative for oyster and submerged aquatic vegetation habitats on multi-agency teams. Wow, when do you sleep? Megan grew up in Ottawa, Canada, exploring the many freshwater lakes and streams before heading south for her studies. Megan received her BA in political science and biology from Duke University, her MA in marine science from the Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences, College of William and Mary, and her PhD in oceanography from LSU. Welcome, Megan, and again, thank you so much for being tonight's speaker, as well as the last of our science talks for the semester.
All right, great, thank you. Let me get my screen up. All right, are we good?
Yes, ma'am, you're good to go.
All right, well, thank you to Mert for inviting me and letting me finish off this crazy year and with LumCon Science Talks. And I appreciate everyone who's taken the time to tune in from home, and hopefully some of those you who like oysters are actually enjoying a plate of oysters as I talk. So I'm going to talk about oysters. I study oysters, and usually when I tell people that, they look at me funny and kind of ask why. They seem pretty boring. So my goal tonight is to show you that they're not boring, and not only do they have some neat quirks that make for fascinating conversation, but knowing and understanding some of these quirks will hopefully make you see them as superheroes, and that's my goal. They are incredibly important to our coastal waters. They feed our population, and as a result, there's been an enormous amount of effort and thought being put into managing and restoring oysters so that we have them around for the future. I'm going to start with, let me get this right, a little bit of history. So oysters have been feeding the masses for a long time, likely preceding Greek and Roman times, but there's significant evidence that oysters were very much enjoyed by the Greeks and the Romans. As this floor mosaic of a Roman dining room shows, there's some oyster shells on the floor, and it kind of makes my teenage kids look like neat freaks. But on top of this, there's evidence, really interesting, that the Greeks cultivated oysters, similar to what is done here in Louisiana, where we still cultivate wild oysters. There is specifically evidence that Greeks placed pottery shards and old shell in the water to recruit oyster spat, and then moved these baby oysters to more favorable growing areas. Another interesting piece of history of oysters is that their shells have actually been used in the voting process by the Greeks. So we complain about some of our voting systems today. Well, they actually would write names on the shells or some of the pottery shards and cast them to vote, often to ban people from society. So for those of you who really think oysters are disgusting and can't believe humans have eaten them for this long, the good news is that it only takes 4 oysters to get your daily dose of iodine, cadmium, copper, iron, phosphorus, zinc, and manganese. And for those of you who think 4 oysters is just a warm-up, well, they're low in cholesterol and they provide you with omega-3 fatty acids and protein, so you can keep eating them. What's also cool about oysters is they're what we would call hyperlocal, and that is that they often reflect the location from where they're take on some flavor. And this is because of the fact that oysters are filter feeders. In fact, one adult has been shown that it can filter up to 50 gallons of water a day. And if you look at the picture on the left here, and many of you may have seen this already, because there's a lot of videos online that show in real time, if you take 2 aquariums and fill it with bay or estuary water, sorry about the slides, and you have oysters in one tank and no oysters in the other, fairly rapidly the water clarity will improve. And this is because oysters will draw in water using these little hairs or cilia across their gills. And all of the particles, the sediments, the phytoplankton that's in the water column will get trapped in the mucus of the gills and taken up to the mouth. What's even cooler is that oysters are picky eaters. So anything in the water column will get pulled in through the gills, but oysters can actually select what they digest and that actually goes in the mouth. And they can select based on size. They can select also via cell surface biochemical signals. And there's some people working on this in different areas, suggest they can actually select phytoplankton species. And what's neat is that, sorry, my slides are switching. What's neat is that what they decide to eat goes through the digestive tract and comes out as what we typically know, so as feces. And what they don't eat also gets packaged by the mucus and deposited on the bottom. So regardless of whether they eat the food, they actually may handle all of it, and most of it gets cleared from the water column. And they need to be efficient as filter feeders because the other thing is they can't chase down their food. Except for the first 2 or 3 weeks of life, oysters are stuck in one place. And this has a lot of consequences for how oysters survive and how they adapt and how we might manage them. So generally, oysters are mass spawners. Basically, if you have reproductive adults on the reef with a certain trigger, which down here in Louisiana we tend to think of as higher water temperatures above 20, 21 degrees Celsius, and they'll release the eggs and sperm in the water. The eggs will be fertilized and they will move in the water column and be trained in the currents for 2 to 3 weeks before they get heavier and settle as spat. I don't know why my mouse is, apologies, and settle as spat, where they will live for the rest of their life. And so the fact that they are attached and can't move explains a lot of neat adaptations and capabilities. One is that oysters change sex. They are what we call hermaphroditic. So oysters, the smaller oysters, tend to be male, and as they get bigger, more of them become female. We don't know a lot about what triggers this, but we do know that they can also switch back from being female to being male again. And this is thought to occur when conditions are more stressful. And so the thought is that it takes more energy to be a female because eggs cost more than sperm. And so it might be a response related to how much energy is involved. Other thing, adaptation or key thing about oysters that we need to know is that they can adjust to, they are osmoconformers. It means that they adjust the blood and body fluid to the salinity of the surrounding waters. And this makes a lot of sense because oysters live in estuaries, which is essentially areas where the land and the sea meet. And so as being fixed in space, the water over them or the salinity over them can change over time. And it changes based on how much water, fresh water, is coming in off of the rivers and the land. And that can change based on upstream precipitation events or in the spring snowmelt from up north. And it can change based on the tidal cycle and based on storms that might push salt water into the sea. So the fact that oysters are fixed in space and have to deal with salinity, the fact that they can adjust to changing salinity is a really important thing that allows for them to survive in these estuaries. But keep in mind, and we'll come back to this later because this is a really key point, that this takes energy. Oysters can live and survive in a wide range of salinities and can live and survive when salinities change a lot, but it requires a lot of energy just to maintain themselves under those conditions. So another key feature gets at the fact that these oysters tend to build reefs. In Louisiana in particular, it is the only native reef building organism. And so the habitat that they create is really unique, especially because we have a lot of soft sediments that are around there. And they build this three-dimensional complex habitat that has been shown to support the high productivity in some of the commercially and recreationally important fish and crustacean species that we rely on. And so the oysters make for a unique habitat that wouldn't exist if we didn't have them here. The other thing as hard bottom habitat is that reefs can impact wave energies and trap sediments. And in fact, in the last decade, both in Louisiana and around the world, oyster reefs that are adjacent to eroding shorelines are being used as what we are calling living shorelines. In some cases, they're being placed adjacent to eroding shorelines because the thought is that they can be used to reduce erosion, and because they're living, as new oysters get settle on there, the reefs can still grow. And in fact, a study that we completed recently that looked at living shoreline oyster reefs from New Jersey all the way down the Atlantic coast through Florida into Alabama and Louisiana showed that when we measured wave energies in front of a reef and behind the reef, that the reef reduced wave energy by over 75%. So this graph is showing the predicted the wave energy basically in front and behind the reef. And if there was no impact, all of our data points would match. I apologize for these slides, would match that dotted line. And lastly, we know that oysters support an economically and culturally important fishery. The eastern oyster, which is what grows down here and on the east coast of the United States, 80% of the US production occurs in the northern Gulf of Mexico, and over 50% of that production occurs in Louisiana. So yes, oysters are important in Louisiana, both for the ecosystem services they provide, but also for their production as food item. So knowing all this, however, about 10 years ago, a study was completed where they looked at shellfish reefs, many of which are created by oysters, and in some places the eastern oyster. And they compared the extent of oyster reefs about a century ago to the current extent of oyster reefs, and looked at how that has changed over time. And if you can see this map, it's taken from this study. On the left, the areas in the reds and the dark reds, I guess, and light red, are areas that were identified as functionally extinct or poor. That meant that more than 85% of the historical extent of reef had disappeared. In yellow, which is this area here in the Gulf of Mexico, is in yellow, which called the reefs to be in fair condition. But in this study, fair condition meant that they'd still lost up to 50% of the extent of the reefs historically. And so that was kind of a wake-up call. But that's looking backwards at what's happened in the past. So we also wanted to look at what do we think in the future? What's going on with climate change, with coastal development, and will it continue to impact the reefs? And are they vulnerable to these changes that we predict from rising sea levels and increasing temperatures? And this picture on the right shows the result of a vulnerability assessment of oyster reefs. And you can see that it's in yellow and orange, which indicated that they were moderately to highly vulnerable to the predicted changes that we expect along the Gulf Coast. So this means we need to do something. We need to think about what's going on with the oysters, and knowing what we do about their life and some of their adaptations, what can we do? So on the left is a graphic from NOAA that identified, and we've touched on some of these already, some of the major ecosystem stressors to oysters. And these all deal with the water column. So one is salinity. We talked about salinity and how it can change with the differences in how much fresh water is coming down our rivers, or how much fresh water is not being let out because we've dammed some of the rivers, and how much variation there is in the salinity. The other thing that we are well aware of is that increasing temperatures with global change, we've already shown that temperatures are increasing in time. Are we in the subtropical environment hitting areas where the oysters may not be able to function very well? And we know it's happening down here because on the right is some data from Alabama. On the top graph shows the air temperature and the number of days that exceeded 20 degrees Celsius, going from the 70s up to 2007. And you can see that that has increased pretty consistently over time. On the bottom, because oysters live in the water, the authors of this looked at sea surface temperature. And here you go from 1987 to 2007. And these are the mean sea surface temperatures in the fall. And there's approximately a 4 degrees Celsius increase in just those few decades. So we certainly have an issue with increasing temperatures that we need to think about. And then the last one is low dissolved oxygen. We haven't looked at it that much within the inland coastal areas where oysters grow, but that's kind of associated with climate change. Increasing temperatures reduces oxygen solubility, and if we have differences in increasing nutrient inputs, we may have more and more inland coastal problems with dissolved oxygen. And so, excuse me, to better understand and to be able to predict and manage the consequences of these changing coastal conditions, some of which we can control locally, but many of them we can't, we have to go back to the basics. Looking at how oysters breathe, feed, grow, and reproduce or die under different conditions is really important. And the basic question is what we call, it's used for scope for growth, kind of looking at energy. How much energy do you take in via feeding? And how does that change under the different conditions? And how much energy are you expending? sort of the basics of everybody's life, right? So we started in the lab with measures of an oyster's metabolism. And the theory behind all of this work, and it's kind of the underpinning of a lot of the models, is that energy is first allocated for basic survival or maintenance. And this amount of energy that's required for your basic survival can change with salinity or temperature. If it takes more energy to maintain one's cells, you may have less energy to grow or to reproduce. So if you look at this on the left, this graph on the y-axis is showing clearance rate, or the filtration rate that we talked about earlier for oysters. And it's a rough measure of how much food or energy is being acquired. There are other factors involved, but essentially the assumption here is that if you're given the same food mix and you have a higher clearance rate, you'll take in more food and you'll have more energy available for growth. And so what you see, and we looked at this at the typical winter and summer temperatures in Louisiana and across the salinity range that we see oysters growing in our Louisiana estuaries. And what you see is that clearance rate is mostly impacted by salinity, with decreasing food intake as salinity decreases from 15. So at lower salinities, oysters will take in less food and have less energy available for growth. And this kind of matches what we know and see in the field. In contrast, if you look at the right panel, this y-axis is oxygen consumption, and it's a measure of the energy used to survive. So higher respiration rates represent a higher use of energy. I mean, think about it when you go for a run and you start breathing more heavily, odds are you're using more energy. And so you have less energy available for growth. On this one, the main trend is that the warmer summer temperatures, oysters had a higher oxygen consumption rate, meaning that they were using more energy just to survive and maintain themselves and reducing the energy for growth. And again, this matches what we see for adult oysters in our Louisiana waters. And it's a little bit more complicated, but essentially we strive to understand how the balance of energy input and output will change with changing conditions. And this can hopefully help us get at better understanding and predicting the growth and the mortality of the oyster, which is key to a lot of what we do and what we manage for. So these two figures are taken from by using the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries 40-year data set from monitoring of oysters. And we looked at mortality on the left panel and growth on the right panel in relation to salinity and temperature across our coast. And the main thing to note, and I'll start with the growth, is that the maximum growth rate occurred in the mid-20s temperature and at the higher salinity. We'll estimate about 15. My slides are going. And that's kind of what we would have predicted from those lab experiments I showed. And the converse is true here, that lowest mortality occurs at salinity somewhere between 10 and 15 and at mid 20-degree temperatures. So what's really interesting when we did this work is that Louisiana oysters were thriving under lower salinity and higher temperature conditions than is generally reported for this species of oyster. And it could make sense because a lot of the previous work really came from more temperate climates where they weren't getting the same temperature ranges or always the same low salinities that we see. But it made us start thinking about across the coast of Louisiana, while this presents an average for all of the Louisiana oysters, we do know that each of our estuaries, and these are some of the major oyster producing estuaries in Louisiana, so it's indicated, for those not familiar with Louisiana, it's indicated by these stars on this map of Louisiana. And what you're seeing with these colors is an interpolated salinity layer in our coastal waters. And the main thing to note is that on the top is the mean winter salinity, and on the bottom is the variance, the amount of variation in salinity. So if you recall from earlier, it takes energy. Oysters can adapt to all these different and conform to the different salinities, but it takes energy. The higher the variation, the more energy it takes. And so if you look at each of these estuaries, you can see that each of them have a very unique signature. And so we started wondering if these oysters actually had some local adaptations to these differences in conditions. And we went and looked at, we used again some Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries data, a 20-year data set that they had for 2 of their big oyster growing areas, Breton Sound and Barataria Bay. And when salinity and temperature were similar, we looked at growth and mortality of the oysters. Main thing to take away from here is that if you look at the blue lines, Breton Sound, you could see that when salinity decreased, was lower, growth was decreasing, and mortality was increasing, and that it was far more sensitive to the decreasing salinity than the Barataria Bay oysters. So it kind of indicated that maybe there's something going on here and that there is some local adaptation to the conditions that they experience. Just to kind of check, we reached out and worked with some great people at Texas A&M Corpus Christi, because they work with oysters in areas with much, much higher salinity regimes. This is a 10-year average, so they have salinity over 30, while we have bays with salinities less than 10. It's a huge difference. And we just looked at basic mortality of oysters at a range of salinities going from 2 to 44. And it confirmed what we found before, that oysters from the highest salinity had greater mortality in the low salinity areas and lower mortality in the high salinity, indicating that they had some level of adaptation to these different conditions. And what's really cool and what's really exciting, and this is going beyond what I do, I'm just promoting some other people's work, is that these findings are important on several levels. And the most immediate practical use relates to the development of the aquaculture industry or the restoration of oysters and oyster reefs, where you can start trying to match and breed oysters for specific conditions in different estuaries. And you can also breed them with an eye on the idea of looking at how the conditions are going to change over time. This study was done by a group in Maryland, in a Lewis Plow's lab, and they actually found through comparing 50 half-sibling families, evidence suggested that low salinity survival may indeed be a heritable trait in which you could then select. And so the geneticists are kind of taking this and running with it, and it's really kind of neat. And it's neat because it can feed into the development of bivalve aquaculture. It can also help for restoration and breeding oysters for restoration stock. This is just a picture of the Michael C. Voisin hatchery in Louisiana, where we have different lines growing out different populations of oysters. And the idea being that if you can identify oysters that can tolerate this low salinity, there may be times where we have lower, we might be able to reduce some of these lower production years, such as 2019, when we had a lot of low salinity areas. Still, other factors, most of our work's been with salinity, but other stressors could be important, and we're starting to explore with different populations of oysters how they may respond to hypoxia or increasing temperatures, to see if there's some temperature thresholds that need to be considered as we try to restore the oyster reefs and develop our aquaculture industry. And so this is the only kind of ugly graph that I'm putting up here, but I think it kind of pulls together how knowing how oysters respond at the most basic level to changing conditions can really help us to develop the predictive tools to inform management and restoration. And this is basically adapted from a lot of the modelers that have worked on oysters over the years. And it ties in and shows really directly how environmental conditions can affect metabolism, so filtration and respiration of the oysters. And defining those relationships can help us get at the growth, mortality of oysters. And this is really important. So not only in helping develop, ensuring good production and developing an aquaculture industry, but Louisiana has a $50 billion coastal management plan. There's also a significant amount of money to restore oysters that have come out of things such as the natural resource damage assessment from the 2010 oil spill. And knowing and figuring out how to invest that money wisely is really important. So those of you not familiar with this master plan, this is from our 2017 version. It's updated every 5 years. The plan calls for a lot of activities that will look to, it's indicated in green, restore marsh, or they might put in some shoreline protection, some of which are actually living shorelines with bioengineered reefs. And there's also a lot of plans to do what we call sediment diversions, and it's putting some of the Mississippi River or river water directly into our estuaries, and that is likely to change again on top of what's going on with climate change, but it may change the properties of the water, putting more sediment, and change the temperatures, salinity, etc. And so we can use this basic data to build some really neat models. And this is the output from one worked on with Hongxing Wang with the USGS. And this model was built for Breton Sound, one of our big oyster producing areas, Louisiana. And these blobs here are basically the model extent, which is the inside of Breton Sound. And what we were able to do was predict oyster biomass under scenarios of 2 proposed river diversions. So Breton Sound has a Carnarvon freshwater diversion upstream, which allows different amounts of water to be put into Breton Sound. And so there, at the time that we were running this, there were looked at 2 scenarios of 5,000 cubic feet per second or 250,000 cubic feet per second. And you can see how the oyster biomass shifts under these different scenarios. And this scale is blue is basically 0 biomass, with red being your highest biomass. Also ran the model looking at potential sea level rise that have been suggested for this area. And then the bottom are the 4 combinations of scenarios that are out there. But you can start to see how this information can be useful when managers are looking at figuring out where the current and future oyster production areas might be and where they should be investing money. And this is demonstrated pretty well in this, with this slide. On the left, this was sort of an old draft version that shows where existing oyster reefs are, and looks at the idea indicated by the green star of building oyster sanctuary areas where you can kind of have a protected oyster area to ensure a reef into the future. And you can start by looking at these proposed areas and think about how it might look in the future based on some of the different scenarios that you can run. And this is useful not only in thinking about oyster production, but for applying it to other types of restoration projects. In Louisiana, we have about a 10-year history of doing research and putting in some living shorelines. And these are ones using bioengineered reef products that were placed, I think this was about 3 years ago in yellow. It was placed here, and this one was closer to 10 years ago in green, and it was placed about there. I apologize for these slides. And again, you can kind of build these models based on what we know of oysters and identify suitable habitat for the oysters, because these bioengineered reefs and their role in protecting the shoreline are highly dependent in the long term on recruiting oysters and growing oysters. and hopefully the oysters can grow and the reef can keep up with sea level rise. So this is a picture of another type of model, a suitability model. It was built with Tom Sonyak for one of the earlier master plans, with the red showing areas where oysters habitat should be suitable for oysters. And this was a scenario for 2023. And green areas where oysters wouldn't grow. And so this can help managers select the best areas to start putting building projects and promoting some of the production. And so I'm going to kind of stop there, because it kind of shows that knowing about oyster breathing could actually help save our coast and ensure that we have oysters to eat in the future. And if you don't believe me now, I strongly suggest you take a look at this great article. Came out just last week in bbc.com, and it's titled "The Simple Food That Fights Climate Change." And they talk about how filter feeding animals can help clean up our waters and nourish 1 billion people. And so hence the superhero status and why oysters really are so cool. Before I go, I just want to be clear that this work was a collaboration with lots and lots of really great people across the Gulf Coast and in other parts of the country and the world. And that funding came from a lot of state and federal agencies who have supported this, including Louisiana Department of Wildlife Fisheries and some nonprofit organizations who have helped with much of this work. And of course, I can never forget all the many collaborators and students who helped, graduate and undergraduate, in collecting all of this data, because they were absolutely critical to this. And so that is all I have, and I'll take questions.
Great. Thank you, Megan, so much. We do have several questions rolling in. I just want to give people some time to type those in, get them to us, maybe let you rest your voice a little bit. But I'm kind of interested to know how you got so passionate about oysters.
I don't know, they're cool. I just started, when you start looking at them and thinking about all of the things they do, you know, and I think coming down here, it's all about the marsh and the mud. And there are other things out there, and I think they're equally important. And we need to recognize that. And they are good to eat.
They are good to eat, yes. As much of our audience will agree. The first question is coming from George, and he's asking how the pseudofeces is produced and discarded. Does it travel through the digestive tract or some other mechanism?
No, so it's, I mean, it all goes through the gills and they get packaged in mucus and it just gets shot out. It does not go through the digestive tract.
Mary's interested to know what impact hurricanes have on the oyster populations in Louisiana.
I think it varies. It depends what the hurricane does. In general, I mean, the hurricane will, you know, it'll change the water quality a little bit. During the hurricane, obviously, you'll have a lot more turbid water. You may have more salt water pushed in, but it's usually short-lived. And so the oysters are fine. They can close up and not for fairly, you know, days or possibly, you know, even weeks. Probably the biggest risk, although I don't know that I've seen it happen, would be if a hurricane moves a lot of sediment or large stuff and smothers a reef. But I don't know if I've really seen that happen, because around here, our sediment's often so fine that it'll get cleared out before a lot of the oysters it will die, but that's probably the biggest risk.
Interesting. Chandler has a question about microplastics and if we're seeing increased levels of microplastics in oysters, or are they relatively immune because they can select food items?
I don't know. I don't know that I've ever seen anybody, I'm trying to think of some recent Um, there have probably been a few studies. I know I've seen some stuff on microplastics recently, but I can't remember if they looked at within oysters or oyster tissue. So I don't know. That's a good question. Something to look at if it hasn't been looked at.
Absolutely. Sounds like a graduate student project.
It does.
Thomas is asking if you could elaborate on the relationships that oyster reefs have with other marine animals.
So there's the physical relationship in that they provide structure. So there's some fish and crustaceans that we call reef residents, such as gobies that tend to live and make their home around the reef. And then there's also what we call transient species that might use the reef just during a certain part of their life. So maybe when they're juveniles and they have some spaces to hide. Fishermen will go to reefs in order to fish because it's often a place where some of the larger fish will go to feed because they know there's a high density of organisms there. There may also, because they filter the water and can change the energy environment, there's probably some impacts there in terms that benefit some of the other organisms that are around, although I don't know if I've seen specific studies that have quantified that in certain ways. Is that what you're looking for?
Yes, thank you, Thomas says.
Find it.
Arturo would like to know, do you take into account the increased flooding events of the Mississippi River in models or your collaborators?
Trying to think. I mean, often depends what the model is doing. So some of the models was looking at specific scenarios into the future. Some other work that we've done has taken sort of different, like an average river flow year and compared it to a high river flow year. I mean, theoretically, you could kind of take any scenario that you wanted and apply it to the model. I don't know if I've been involved in anything where they've looked at frequency or number of flood events and built it into the model. So most of the models to date that may change your question have really just been looking at a 1-year cycle. We haven't gotten into these multiple years where you're looking at reproduction. Has been something that we don't have a great handle on for oysters. So going through multiple generations is not something that we've done yet.
Is that something that you're leading into, looking at like the effects of a 100-year flood or 500-year floods, those kind of things?
We could look at it on a 1-year basis. So the difficulty, well, in my brain, and I'm not a modeler, is that oysters are mass spawners. So trying to figure out, there's a lot of question. We're just starting to get a handle on whether a reef is self-recruiting. So if the oysters on that reef spawn their eggs and sperm, when they fertilize, how many of those actually settle back on that reef and how many of them are transported to another reef? Because oysters populations and reefs are connected as metapopulations. And there's some debate, at one point they were thinking that reefs generally didn't self-recruit. So any one reef was dependent on an upstream or downstream estuary reef. But a recent study came out that showed that maybe in some situations, the veligers and the recruits don't move that far. And so when we try to look at population changes over time, we haven't quite figured out how to identify or quantify the amount of recruitment per year, because you don't know if you relate it to the reef you're working on or if you have to tie it into surrounding reefs.
That makes sense. Steve was wondering about the diversity in oyster populations and if there is enough diversity within those populations to survive the environmental changes that are predicted to occur.
So by diversity, I'm guessing you might be talking about genetic. And that is something, there are people that are starting to work on that. That's not my field, but we are seeing through our population or phenotypic response studies that there do seem to be a lot of local populations that respond differently to different conditions. And so we'll see. I guess it's something that's being actively worked on. My work's more the phenotypic level, but we have some good geneticists at LSU and then up the East Coast, the group that I saw you, that are starting to look at some of the different genetic differences between populations.
Alice is wondering, apart from enjoying eating oysters, she's wondering if there's anything that humans can do to help the oyster populations.
That's
a great question, Alice. Thank you for that one.
I don't know. You stumped me.
Difficult to answer.
Yeah, I mean, you know, one of the things, and some areas have gotten into in Texas, North Carolina, there's some debate as to whether some of the decline is so oysters build their reefs and maintain their reefs through their recruitment and their growth, but also through their death, because the shells are the habitat that the new recruits come to. And so when we're harvesting off these reefs and you're taking those shells and throwing them in the dumpster, we're losing that potential future habitat. And so some states and regions, and I think it's one of our nonprofits, CRCL, actually had money to do a recycle your shells program. And I know we had one for a little bit out of New Orleans. Texas has a Sink Your Shucks program. North Carolina, I think, was the first one that started a shell recycling program where they collect all the shell and return it to the waters to make sure that there's habitat for the new recruits to come to. That works as long as many of our oysters stay in the state. I don't know how many leave our state, but that's something, I guess, on one scale we could think about.
Yeah, sink your shucks, people. Alice is also wondering if there are any animals that live in an oyster other than the oyster itself.
Not really. When you sample them, there's little mud crabs and stuff that will use the shells. But that's, there are the worms and things like that that you'll find.
Thomas is asking if oysters are only coastal or if you can find them on the bottom of the ocean or in lakes.
So they live in salt water, brackish water, and they tend to be coastal. Well, they tend to live in shallower water environments. So they tend to be the coastal and brackish or saline water. They do not live in fresh water.
Jennifer would like to know if low salinities affect larval recruitment of oysters.
So low salinity is, depends on the low salinity, oysters tend not to reproduce. So it will, because they're stressed. So you won't get a lot of recruitment of oysters existing in low salinity. I don't know, we're really just getting into looking at larval survival. and what their tolerance range is. And there might be a few studies, but this is relatively new because where the oyster hatcheries and the people that run those facilities probably know more than I do. So I don't know what the tolerance ranges are for larvae. And that would be probably what restricts whether they would recruit into low salinity waters, as well as if they're available, if there's any reproductive oysters in the vicinity.
Perfect. There's a lot of questions coming in, as you can imagine, about how freshwater diversions affect oysters. A couple of times the bonacary has been mentioned.
So I can't speak specifically to a freshwater diversion or the bonacary event specifically, because I think what you just have to think about is it depends on what the oyster reef is experiencing in terms of what the actual impact of these diversions or the opening of the spillway are over the reef. And it's not just what the impact is, but how long it lasts. So oysters can live for a fairly long time. We've had them in the lab without food, looking at different salinities where they've lasted for several months because they can kind of close up and conserve their energy. So it's a combination of things. And then the other thing is that it's often the multiple stressors that can get them. So a low salinity event alone is not necessarily detrimental to a lot of our oysters, but the timing of it in terms of with high temperature. So we saw some of the stuff, how temperature was particularly stressful. And our summers where we're getting these high temperatures, sometimes above 30, for those of you who work out in some of our coastal waters, those high temperatures combined with a low salinity can be pretty rough on the oysters. But low salinity in cooler temperatures in the winter may be fine. So it's a complex question. The freshwater diversions, that comes to the timing and the length of it and the impact over the reef on the water quality, I think is what you have to think about. There isn't a clear answer.
I think it was 2011, we had a lot of fresh water come down the system. I think it was 2011. And that right on the heels was a very cold period. We had a really cold winter that winter. Do you recall that at all? That was a long time ago.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember.
But I know there were some people who were looking at recruitment that year and they were expecting a very bad recruitment. Would that be one of those events where you got a double whammy kind of thing?
Yeah. Well, I think I have a vague recollection. I think I had a student working out in Breton Sound during that. But I think there's a lot about timing. So generally the big reproduction has generally been thought to occur sometime April, May, but it's when the temperatures go up above, 20, 21 or something like that Celsius. And so I know there's been years where it's been delayed or where it's gotten warm really early, and how that might coincide with the spring runoff or the snow melt can be really important for that first big mass, spawning and recruitment. And yeah, I think there was something, I'm thinking 09 to 10, 11, I know there was the oil spill, there was a lot going on. But yeah, I mean, the timing of sometimes these freshwater diversions when you open it, or the timing of the warmer temperatures with the snow melt coming down from the north can be really important in terms of the first recruit set for our oysters.
Great. Arturo would like to know if you think oysters are an organism that would be able to adapt to our rapidly changing climate.
That's what we're trying to figure out. If they can, if they can adapt to, we're looking at these temperature thresholds. So one, is there a threshold where the high temperature is really detrimental to the oysters? And I think the key to that question is figuring out if there are different, like with salinity, populations that have different tolerances, and can we, and is it something that's heritable? Can we breed for these populations that have a higher threshold? So how quickly a population might change, that I don't know. That might be something more for somebody who deals with the genetics or local adaptation more.
Chandler has an interesting question about ocean acidification, and he's wondering, that word always makes me laugh. Sorry, guys. But Chandler would like to know if the changing pH levels of the ocean are making it more difficult for oysters to form their shells.
So yeah, there's a couple of groups that have worked on this a lot, and on the Gulf right now, on the Pacific coast, they've shown impacts of acidification on the larvae and their formation and survival. And there's been a number of lab experiments. There's a group up around the Chesapeake that does that work. So it is a potential threat. We're kind of unique here with the Mississippi River in our coastal environment, that the variation that we get in the pH levels right now is pretty large and much bigger than the predicted change in what's being predicted for acidification within our coastal waters, at least over the short term. But in terms of the most likely scenario is that we're going to see problems with the larvae and the initial shell formation, which is what they've seen with the Pacific coast oysters already.
So the younger oysters are more susceptible to those changing pH levels than the
That's what they've shown so far, yeah.
Is there any effect on the larger adult oysters?
Probably. I'm trying to pull up. I know there have been some studies with the shell, but I would have to look it up to give you a correct answer. Otherwise, I'm just guessing right now.
What would be some of those impacts to the shells? Would they pit, or would they get softer?
I don't know exactly. The issue is if it's the formation alone and building new shell is what I would be inclined to say. Unless you're getting really, really acidic, and then, yeah, there may be some serious issues.
And then our last question of the night. Sorry, you guys, if I didn't get to your question. We have a lot of them. If you do have a question that you would like Megan to answer, please send me an email with that question, and I will be happy to get it over to Megan and get you an answer. But we're gonna end tonight on an opinion type question. So Mary would like to know what type of oyster you prefer to eat. What is your favorite?
A Louisiana oyster.
Of course.
What else can I say? And yeah.
What does salty oyster mean? I always wondered that.
So if you've had, I know you don't eat oysters, but oysters from saltier environments. So our Louisiana oysters are generally from low salinity. When you look at where a lot of the aquaculture is, oysters, from other regions tend to be grown in higher salinity waters, and so they would be saltier.
Gotcha. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Duh. All right. I want to thank our audience for joining us again tonight for, like I said, the last presentation of LumCon Science Talks for the semester. We will be back. We're not sure exactly when, but we will be back after the holidays. There's going to be some modifications to the format, at least on our ends, which we hope our audience will certainly enjoy. So be looking for future LumCon Science Talks. Keep in mind that they will be a little bit modified, but I think that it will help engage interaction with scientists, and we can hear what they really think. So Megan, again, thank you. And I really hope everybody out there, including Megan, have a safe and happy holiday.
Great. Thank you, Mert.
You're welcome. Good night, everyone.